Right now, somewhere in a government office, there's a legal document that says no nation can claim sovereignty over the moon. But that same document says nothing about what happens when a private company builds a city there. In 2020, NASA published the Artemis Accords, and 8 countries signed immediately. By 2025, over 30 nations joined. Yet the document carefully avoids the one question everyone wants answered: who actually governs when humans live permanently beyond Earth? Before we start, a quick roll call. Write in the comments which part of this planet you're watching from, and then just listen and enjoy. Here's what makes this moment unusual. We're not theorizing about distant futures anymore. SpaceX plans crewed Mars missions in the early 2030s. China and Russia announced joint lunar base timelines. Private companies are already mining legal pathways for asteroid resources worth quintillions of dollars. But our legal frameworks were written in 1967, when landing on the moon itself seemed barely possible. That treaty, the Outer Space Treaty, declares space the province of all mankind and forbids national appropriation. Beautiful words. But they create a vacuum where the most practical questions have no answers. Who arrests someone for assault in a Mars habitat? Which court handles a contract dispute between a lunar mining company and its Earth investors? If a child is born on a generation ship halfway to Jupiter's moons, what citizenship do they hold? These aren't philosophical puzzles. They're questions people will face within 20 years, and we have no consensus on the answers. Throughout human history, governance has always followed expansion, never preceded it. When Phoenician traders sailed beyond the Mediterranean 3,000 years ago, they brought their laws with them, adapting them to new circumstances. When European powers explored the Americas, they eventually created entirely new legal systems, often through conflict and terrible injustice, but always through the practical necessity of organizing human behavior in new places. The American frontier developed its own rough justice before formal law arrived. Antarctic research stations function under their home nation's laws because the Antarctic Treaty explicitly allows it, but that only works because Antarctica remains a temporary scientific outpost, not a permanent settlement. Space presents something fundamentally different. It's not just a new frontier. It's an environment where the basic assumptions underlying Earth's governance don't apply. Borders mean nothing when you're in orbit. Traditional concepts of sovereignty dissolve when you're 3 days' travel from any nation's territory. The monopoly on violence that defines state power becomes complicated when a habitat can simply seal its airlocks. And the speed of light itself creates communication delays that make real-time governance from Earth physically impossible for anything beyond the moon. The Outer Space Treaty emerged from Cold War anxieties. The United States and Soviet Union both recognized that claiming celestial bodies could trigger armed conflict. So they agreed. No nation owns space. Everyone can explore it peacefully, and weapons of mass destruction are prohibited in orbit. Elegant in its simplicity. But it was written for an era of national space programs, not commercial space industries. It was designed for flags and footprints, not permanent cities and resource extraction. Consider the paradox embedded in current space law. The treaty says you cannot claim sovereignty over celestial bodies, but the 2015 Space Act, passed by the United States, explicitly allows American companies and citizens to own resources they extract from asteroids or other bodies. Luxembourg passed similar legislation. So did the United Arab Emirates, The logic goes, we're not claiming the territory, just the resources we extract from it. But imagine applying that principle on Earth. I cannot claim sovereignty over your farm, but I can own all the crops I harvest from it. The distinction becomes meaningless in practice. Or consider this scenario, entirely plausible by 2035. A SpaceX settlement on Mars has 300 residents. Someone commits a serious crime, perhaps violence against another resident. SpaceX is a private company, not a government. It has terms of service, not laws. It has security personnel, not police, with arrest authority recognized by any nation. The victim is Canadian, the perpetrator is Japanese, and the incident occurred on Mars, which belongs to no nation. Who has jurisdiction? Under what legal framework? The Outer Space Treaty says activities in space remain under the jurisdiction of the country of registry. But that was written for spacecraft and astronauts, not permanent settlements with multinational populations. The questions multiply. If you're born on Mars, are you Martian? If your parents were American and Chinese, do you get dual Earth citizenships for a planet you've never visited? When does a settlement become large enough to claim self-governance? At 1,000 people? 10,000? Does population size even matter? Or is it about self-sufficiency? And who decides? These aren't just legal technicalities. They're questions about power, identity, and the social contract itself. Every stable society rests on some form of consent, some agreement about who makes rules and why those rules deserve to be followed. On Earth, that consent is backed by territory, by the ability of a state to enforce its will within defined borders. In space, those foundations shift. A Mars colony could theoretically seal itself off from Earth entirely. An orbital habitat could change its trajectory. The traditional tools of governance enforcement, physical control of territory and populations, work differently when your society lives in an artificial environment that can, in principle, just leave. This creates both danger and opportunity. The danger is obvious. Without clear governance frameworks, space settlement could become a chaotic frontier where power flows to whoever has the most resources and the fewest scruples. Company towns in space, with all the exploitation that historically accompanied company towns on Earth, or competing national claims that escalate into conflict. The opportunity is equally profound, a chance to design governance systems from first principles, learning from thousands of years of human political evolution while not being bound by the accumulated weight of existing institutions. Some argue we should extend Earth's governance systems into space. UN control, perhaps, with the Security Council making decisions for off-world settlements. But the UN can barely coordinate action on Earth, where communication is instant and shared interests are obvious. Others propose that space settlements should be autonomous from day one, free to create their own systems. But that risks recreating all of humanity's historical mistakes, or worse, creating new forms of tyranny in environments where dissent is physically constrained. The truth is, we're about to conduct the largest experiment in human governance since the emergence of democracy itself. And we're doing it without a clear plan, driven by technological capability and economic incentive rather than careful political design. That's not necessarily bad. Some of humanity's best institutions emerged from practical necessity rather than abstract planning. Common law developed from merchants needing to resolve disputes. Democratic principles strengthened through societies learning what happened when they were absent. But space is different enough that we cannot simply assume historical patterns will repeat. The environments are hostile in ways Earth never was. The dependencies are absolute. If your life support fails, political philosophy won't save you. The scales are new. Governing 100 people in a single habitat is vastly different from governing 1 million across multiple worlds. And the stakes are higher. Mistakes in space governance could doom entire settlements, while successes could create templates for human flourishing beyond anything Earth has achieved. Over the next episodes, we'll explore how this governance evolution might unfold. We'll look at historical parallels, examining what maritime law and the Antarctic Treaty teach us about governing shared frontiers. We'll investigate the practical questions. How do you actually make decisions when communication takes 20 minutes each way? We'll dive into the economic structures that will shape power relationships between Earth and space settlements. And we'll confront the ethical questions. What do we owe future generations born off-world? And when does planetary protection become an unjust constraint on human expansion? We won't pretend to have all the answers. Nobody does. But we can trace the outlines of the questions, understand why they matter, and see how the choices we make in the next decade will ripple forward for centuries. Because whether we think about it carefully or stumble into it haphazardly, humanity is about to become an interplanetary species. And interplanetary societies will need interplanetary governance. The question isn't whether this will happen. The question is whether we'll be thoughtful about it, or whether we'll simply react to crises as they emerge, building tomorrow's governance from the rubble of today's assumptions. History suggests we'll do some of both. But history also shows that the societies that think ahead, that grapple with difficult questions before they become emergencies, tend to navigate transitions better than those that don't. So let's think ahead together. Let's explore what it means to be human when humanity is no longer confined to one world. And let's see if we can discern, in the patterns of how we've always organized ourselves, some wisdom for how we might organize ourselves among the stars. We've faced this problem before, not in space, but in other places, where the familiar rules of land and borders simply stopped making sense. The open ocean, the polar regions, the electromagnetic spectrum. And each time, humanity eventually figured out how to create order without the traditional tools of territorial control. These precedents aren't perfect guides for space governance, but they reveal patterns in how we think about shared frontiers. Start with the ocean. For most of human history, coastal nations claimed whatever waters they could effectively patrol, usually 3 nautical miles, the distance a cannon could fire from shore. Beyond that lay the open sea, governed by custom and occasional violence. Pirates operated in legal gray zones. Naval powers enforced their own interpretations of maritime rights. It was messy, often brutal, but it functioned after a fashion because the ocean was primarily a transit route, not a place people lived. That changed as ocean resources became valuable. Fish stocks, shipping lanes, and eventually, oil beneath the seabed. Suddenly, nations wanted to claim much more than 3 miles. In 1945, President Truman declared U.S. jurisdiction over the continental shelf's resources. Other nations followed. By the 1960s, competing maritime claims threatened to carve up the oceans into a chaotic patchwork of overlapping territories. So the international community spent years negotiating what became the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, finally adopted in 1982. This treaty created zones of control extending outward from coastlines, territorial waters out to 12 nautical miles, where a nation has full sovereignty, exclusive economic zones out to 200 miles, where a nation controls resources but not navigation, and beyond that, the high seas, belonging to no one and everyone. The deep seabed and its resources were declared the common heritage of mankind, with an International Seabed Authority established to regulate mining. It took decades to negotiate. Some countries still haven't ratified it, and disputes continue. But it created a framework that has largely prevented ocean conflicts. The parallels to space are obvious. Like the high seas, space is vast and difficult to control physically. Like ocean resources, space resources are becoming economically valuable enough to fight over. And like maritime law, space law will probably develop through a mix of practical necessity, economic pressure, and eventual international agreement. But there's a crucial difference. The ocean, however vast, is still part of Earth's environment. It connects territories rather than separating them. Space does both. It connects worlds through travel, but it also isolates them through distance and communication delay. A closer parallel might be Antarctica. When explorers reached the continent in the early 1900s, several nations planted flags and made territorial claims. Britain, Norway, France, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, and Argentina all claimed slices of the continent, some overlapping. By the 1950s, the Cold War made everyone nervous about militarizing Antarctica or fighting over its resources. So in 1959, 12 nations signed the Antarctic Treaty. This treaty is remarkable for what it prohibits: no military activities, no nuclear testing, no waste disposal. All territorial claims are frozen, neither recognized nor rejected, simply set aside. The continent is reserved for peaceful scientific research, with free access for all nations. Any country can inspect any other country's facilities. It's been renewed and expanded multiple times, adding environmental protections and a mining ban. And it's held for over 65 years, even as geopolitics shifted dramatically. Why did it work? Partly because Antarctica is so hostile that living there requires cooperation. Partly because no nation felt strong enough to claim it exclusively without triggering conflict. Partly because it remained primarily a scientific outpost rather than a site of permanent settlement or immediate economic value. These conditions created a window for agreement. Space in the 1960s looked similar. Two superpowers, both capable of reaching space, both nervous about the other militarizing it. An environment so hostile that cooperation made practical sense, and no immediate economic value worth fighting over. The Outer Space Treaty emerged from these conditions in 1967, closely modeled on the Antarctic Treaty. Space is the province of all mankind. No weapons of mass destruction in orbit. Free access for exploration. And critically, no nation can claim sovereignty over celestial bodies. But here's where the parallel breaks down. Antarctica never became economically valuable enough to challenge the treaty's assumptions. It has resources, certainly, but extracting them would be expensive and is prohibited by later agreements. Space is different. Asteroid 16, Psyche, a metal-rich body between Mars and Jupiter, might contain iron, nickel, and precious metals worth $10,000 quadrillion. Even a tiny fraction of that value makes space mining economically compelling. The Moon has helium-3, potentially valuable for future fusion reactors. Mars has water ice, crucial for sustaining settlements. These aren't theoretical resources. They're targets for missions launching in the next 10 to 15 years. The Outer Space Treaty says you can't claim territory, but it's silent on resource extraction. So nations have interpreted that silence as permission. The United States Space Act of 2015 explicitly grants American citizens and companies rights to resources they extract from space. Luxembourg created a legal framework for space mining companies to register there. The UAE followed. Japan and India are developing similar legislation. This isn't a violation of the treaty, exactly. It's an exploitation of what the treaty doesn't say. But imagine this scenario. An American company starts mining an asteroid. A Chinese company arrives at the same asteroid a year later and sets up operations on the opposite side. Both claim they're just extracting resources, not claiming territory. But they need landing pads, processing facilities, storage areas. Their operations expand toward each other. A dispute erupts over whose equipment can go where. There's no property line, no recognized boundary. Both companies appeal to their home governments. Now you have a territorial dispute over a body that nobody can legally claim. How do you resolve it? Or consider the radio spectrum. In the early days of radio, anyone could broadcast on any frequency. The result was chaos, signals interfering with each other, making communication impossible. So nations created the International Telecommunication Union in 1865, originally for telegraph coordination, later expanded to radio. This organization allocates frequencies, assigns orbital slots for satellites, and coordinates to prevent interference. It's not perfect, and powerful nations have more influence than small ones, but it prevents the tragedy of the commons, where everyone's access destroys everyone's ability to use the resource. Space needs something similar for orbital positions, flight paths, and eventually settlement locations. Right now, satellite operators coordinate informally and through national regulators. But low Earth orbit is getting crowded. SpaceX alone has launched thousands of Starlink satellites. Other companies and nations are launching their own constellations. Each satellite needs to avoid colliding with thousands of others. There's no international authority enforcing traffic rules, just voluntary coordination and collision avoidance systems. One major collision, creating a debris cascade, could render entire orbital zones unusable for decades. The pattern across these historical cases is consistent. First comes open access and informal coordination. Then comes increasing crowding and competition. Then come conflicts, near misses, or disasters that make everyone realize the old approach isn't working. Finally comes negotiation of formal frameworks, usually preserving some version of shared access while creating mechanisms for conflict resolution. The process takes decades, and the resulting frameworks are imperfect, but they're better than chaos. We're at the early stage of this pattern for space. Open access, informal coordination, increasing activity. The conflicts haven't happened yet, but they're predictable. A satellite collision cascade, a dispute over lunar base locations, a race for high-value asteroids. These will be our wake-up moments, the crises that force serious negotiation about space governance. But we have an advantage our predecessors didn't. We can see this pattern coming. We can study what worked and what didn't in maritime law, in Antarctica, in spectrum allocation. We can try to establish frameworks before disasters force them. The Artemis Accords, signed by over 30 nations, are an attempt at this. They establish principles for lunar exploration, transparency, interoperability, emergency assistance, space debris mitigation, and crucially, safety zones around facilities where other nations agree not to interfere. Critics note, the accords are led by the United States, exclude nations like China and Russia, and effectively create de facto property rights through safety zones. But supporters argue they're a pragmatic step toward workable governance, creating norms before conflicts arise. Both perspectives have merit. The accords aren't perfect, but perfect is the enemy of functional. What these historical patterns teach us is that space governance will emerge gradually, shaped by practical problems more than abstract principles. It will be messy, contested, probably unfair in various ways. But humans have repeatedly shown we can create workable frameworks for governing shared frontiers when the alternative is chaos or conflict. The ocean didn't become a peaceful commons because nations suddenly became generous. Antarctica isn't a scientific preserve because everyone loves penguins. These frameworks emerged because they served enough people's interests better than the alternatives. Space will be the same, not governed by one world government or pure corporate freedom or simple extension of Earth's borders, but by negotiated frameworks that evolve as circumstances change. The question isn't whether we'll create space governance. We will, because the alternative is unacceptable. The question is whether we'll be smart about it, learning from history's lessons, or whether we'll repeat history's mistakes in an environment where mistakes are far more deadly. Next, we'll look at the practical realities of governing actual settlements on Mars and the Moon. Because abstract legal principles are one thing, deciding who's in charge when someone needs to be arrested, or when a habitat needs to expand into contested territory, or when a colony wants independence from Earth, those are something else entirely. Let's get concrete. It's 2037. A settlement on Mars has 400 permanent residents. They live in interconnected habitats built by 3 different organizations: SpaceX, the European Space Agency, and a consortium of private investors from 6 nations. The residents include engineers, scientists, medical staff, agricultural specialists, and increasingly, people whose jobs exist purely to support the settlement itself: teachers, administrators, maintenance workers. Children have been born there. And one morning, someone wakes up to find their personal equipment sabotaged, expensive damage that could have endangered lives. They know who did it. They have video evidence. Now what? On Earth, the answer is obvious. Call the police. File a report. Let the legal system handle it. But there is no police force on Mars in any traditional sense. There's no judge, no courthouse, no jail. SpaceX, which built and operates most of the habitat, has security personnel. But they're employees of a company, not officers of a recognized legal authority. They have no power to arrest, no jurisdiction recognized by any nation's laws. The perpetrator is a Russian citizen working for ESA. The victim is Brazilian, employed by the private consortium. The incident occurred on Mars, which belongs to no nation. Under the Outer Space Treaty, activities in space fall under the jurisdiction of the nation that registered the spacecraft or installation. But this settlement has 3 different registry nations. And even if jurisdiction were clear, how do you enforce it? You cannot extradite someone to Earth for trial. The next launch window to Earth is 7 months away, costs millions, and is fully booked with cargo. You cannot imprison them. There's nowhere that serves as a jail. You could confine them to quarters, but that requires cooperation from the habitat life support systems, ultimately controlled by SpaceX. You could expel them from the settlement, but that's effectively a death sentence, murder by exile. This scenario isn't hypothetical fear-mongering. It's the kind of problem that will emerge regularly once settlements reach even modest sizes. And it requires answers that our current legal frameworks simply don't provide. So what will actually happen? The settlement will improvise. Probably they'll convene some kind of hearing, representatives from each organizational section. They'll hear evidence, decide on consequences, and enforce them through social pressure and control of access to resources. It will look more like arbitration than criminal justice. And it will work after a fashion, because the alternative is chaos in an environment where chaos kills everyone. But this improvised justice creates deeper questions. Who chose these arbitrators? What gives them authority to make binding decisions? If the accused refuses to accept the ruling, what then? And most importantly, at what point does this improvised system become formal governance, a government in everything but name? The truth is, any permanent settlement beyond Earth will develop governance structures, whether we plan them or not. It's not optional. Humans living together need ways to make collective decisions, resolve disputes, and coordinate behavior. The question isn't whether Mars will be governed, but by whom and by what principles. The early models will almost certainly be corporate. SpaceX talks openly about establishing a city on Mars. They're providing the transportation, building the infrastructure, supplying the resources. In the early years, residents will be SpaceX employees or contractors. The company will set the rules, enforce them through employment contracts, and maintain control through its monopoly on life-critical systems. If you don't like SpaceX's rules, your option is to leave. But leaving means going back to Earth or dying. That's not a free choice. That's coercion dressed in contract language. This should concern us. Company towns have a long and ugly history on Earth. Mining companies in the American West, rubber plantations in South America, factory towns across industrializing Europe, they all followed similar patterns. The company owned the housing, the stores, the infrastructure. Workers were paid in company scrip, only usable at company stores. Prices were set to keep workers perpetually in debt. Dissent was met with eviction, which meant destitution. The system worked beautifully for company profits, terribly for human dignity. Space settlements could easily replicate this dynamic, but worse. On Earth, you could at least walk away from a company town, however difficult that might be. In space, you cannot walk away. The environment itself is lethal. Your survival depends entirely on artificial systems, and whoever controls those systems controls you absolutely. A Mars settlement operated purely as a corporate venture could become the most complete form of corporate control ever achieved. Not through malice necessarily, but simply through the logic of dependency. Some argue this concern is overblown. Companies want productive, satisfied workers, not rebellious ones. Poor treatment leads to poor performance, and in space, poor performance can be catastrophic. Enlightened self-interest will prevent the worst abuses. Maybe. But enlightened self-interest has proven an unreliable safeguard throughout history. And space companies face unique pressures. Mars settlements will be enormously expensive to establish and maintain. Profitability will take decades, if it comes at all. The pressure to extract maximum productivity from workers, to cut costs wherever possible, will be intense. So alternatives are being discussed. Some propose that space settlements should be governed as international zones, with oversight from Earth-based bodies like the UN or a new International Space Authority. Residents would have rights guaranteed by international agreement, independent of corporate employers. Disputes would be adjudicated by neutral parties. Labor standards would be enforced externally. This sounds appealing until you consider the practicalities. A governing body on Earth, trying to manage daily life on Mars, faces that communication delay, 3 to 22 minutes each way, depending on orbital positions. A crisis requiring immediate decision-making cannot wait 44 minutes for Earth to respond. And even if communication were instant, the disconnect between conditions on Earth and conditions on Mars is vast. How can legislators who've never experienced Martian gravity, never felt the psychological weight of living in an enclosed habitat, never faced the specific resource constraints and environmental challenges, how can they make informed decisions about Martian governance? Earth-based oversight might work for high-level principles and dispute resolution, but day-to-day governance must be local. Which brings us to the third model, settlement self-governance from the beginning. Residents elect their own representatives, create their own rules within a constitutional framework, and manage their own affairs. The company or agency that established the settlement provides infrastructure but doesn't govern. It's landlord, not ruler. This is philosophically attractive and practically complicated. Early settlements will be small, maybe a few dozen people initially. They'll all be highly selected, screened for psychological stability and technical competence. They'll depend completely on Earth for supplies. In this context, formal democracy seems premature. With 40 people, you can make decisions through direct discussion. Elections feel like unnecessary bureaucracy, but settlements will grow. At 100 people, maybe you need some formal structure. At 500, you definitely do. At 5,000, you need real government with specialized functions, legislative bodies, judicial systems, enforcement mechanisms. The transition from small outpost to actual polity will happen gradually, and there's no obvious point where you flip a switch and declare, "Now we're a government." History suggests the transition will be messy and contentious. Colonial America started as corporate ventures and religious refugees operating under charters from the British Crown. They developed their own governing institutions slowly through practical necessity. Eventually, those institutions came into conflict with the authority that had originally granted them legitimacy. The result was revolution. Maybe Mars follows a similar path. Maybe the company or nation that establishes a settlement eventually finds that settlement no longer accepts its authority. Maybe independence comes through negotiation, or maybe through conflict. Or maybe space settlements develop entirely new governance models, taking advantage of starting fresh. Imagine a Mars settlement where every resident has direct input on every major decision through digital voting systems. Proposals are debated publicly, amended through transparent processes, and adopted or rejected by popular vote. You could do this because everyone has constant network connectivity. Voting costs nothing, and the small population size keeps the process manageable. It would be true, direct democracy of a kind Athens never achieved, because Athens couldn't efficiently poll everyone constantly. Or imagine a settlement governed by rotating councils, terms of just 6 months, with selection by lottery from qualified volunteers rather than election. This is sortition, an ancient practice experiencing renewed interest on Earth. It prevents the emergence of professional political classes and ensures governance rotates through the population. In a small settlement where everyone's competence has already been vetted, it might work remarkably well. Or perhaps settlements adopt liquid democracy, where you can either vote directly on each issue or delegate your vote to someone you trust on that topic. For habitat engineering decisions, you delegate to someone with engineering expertise. For agricultural policy, you delegate to a farmer. For medical resource allocation, to a doctor. It's representation without fixed terms or broad portfolios, changing fluidly as issues change. These experimental models face obvious challenges. Direct democracy can become tyranny of the majority. Sortition might select poor leaders by chance. Liquid democracy could fragment into chaos or consolidate into oligarchy. But space settlements will be small enough and isolated enough to experiment. If a model fails, the stakes are contained. If it succeeds, it becomes a template. The practical reality is that early space governance will be hybrid and evolving. Corporate authority over infrastructure and operations. Some form of resident input on daily life decisions. Oversight frameworks from Earth for serious disputes and rights protection. And gradually, as settlements grow and become more self-sufficient, a transition toward genuine self-governance. The timeline depends on technology and economics. When can a settlement produce its own food, manufacture its own spare parts, generate its own energy without depending on Earth? When that happens, probably 30 to 50 years after initial establishment, the settlement gains real autonomy because it can survive without Earth. And with economic independence comes political independence, inevitably. So when someone asks who governs Mars, the honest answer is, it depends when you're asking. In 2035, SpaceX governs its outpost through corporate authority. In 2050, a larger settlement might have a hybrid system with corporate management and resident councils. In 2075, a city of 10,000 might be effectively self-governing, with only nominal ties to Earth. And in 2100, Mars might have multiple, independent city-states, each with its own governance model, competing and cooperating across the planet's surface. None of this will proceed smoothly. There will be disputes, power struggles, probably some injustices we'll regret. But there will also be innovation, learning, and adaptation. Because that's what humans do when faced with new circumstances. We figure it out, imperfectly, but persistently. And the question of who decides what on Mars will be answered the same way it's always been answered on Earth, by the people living there, working it out among themselves, one practical problem at a time. There's a fundamental problem with governing Mars from Earth, and it's written into the laws of physics. When Mars and Earth are at their closest, light takes about 3 minutes to travel between them. At their farthest, over 20 minutes. Which means if someone on Mars sends a message asking for guidance, the absolute minimum time for a response is 6 minutes. More commonly, it's 40 to 44 minutes. For urgent decisions, that delay isn't just inconvenient, it's impossible. Imagine you're managing a Mars habitat and a critical system fails. The carbon dioxide scrubbers malfunction. You have maybe an hour before atmospheric CO2 reaches dangerous levels. You need to decide whether to shut down the entire life support system for emergency repairs, which risks other cascading failures, or try a partial fix that might not work. On Earth, you'd consult experts, get authorization from mission control, coordinate carefully. On Mars, you send your question and wait 22 minutes for it to arrive, then another 22 for the response to come back. By the time you get an answer, the decision is already made because it had to be. Everyone lives or dies based on what you chose 40 minutes ago. This changes everything about governance. It means authority must be local. The people on Mars must have the power to make immediate decisions without waiting for Earth's permission. But how do you balance that necessity against accountability? How do you prevent local authority from becoming local tyranny? And how do you maintain meaningful connection between Mars and Earth when every conversation is a slow exchange of messages rather than a dialogue? The delay affects more than emergencies. It shapes the basic texture of governance. On Earth, representative democracy works partly because representatives can consult with constituents relatively easily. A legislator can hold town halls, respond to calls and messages, gauge public opinion quickly. A Martian representative trying to consult with Earth-based authorities or populations faces that same delay in every exchange. A week-long negotiation on Earth becomes a month-long process for Mars. Complex discussions requiring multiple back-and-forth exchanges become painfully slow. The communication lag doesn't just slow things down, it fundamentally alters what kinds of governance are feasible. So Mars will need autonomous decision-making structures from the beginning. Early on, that means trusting small groups of people with enormous authority. The first Mars mission commanders will have power comparable to ship captains at sea, absolute authority within their domain, because getting outside guidance is impractical. As settlements grow, that authority will need to distribute and formalize, but it cannot flow back to Earth. Physics won't allow it. This creates an interesting inversion of how we usually think about colonial governance. Historical colonies were often ruled from distant capitals, with local governors implementing policies made thousands of miles away. Communication was slow, by sailing ship, but it was tolerable because decisions didn't require immediate response. You could wait months for instructions, because most situations could wait months. Space colonies face the opposite situation. Communication is fast by historical standards. Messages arrive in minutes, not months, but decisions cannot wait even those minutes. So governance must be local by necessity, not by choice. What does local governance look like when the population is small and everyone is mission critical? The early research stations in Antarctica provide some clues. These stations have base commanders with clear authority over safety and operations. But for other decisions, they tend to operate more like communes. Scientists and support staff work out arrangements collectively because everyone depends on everyone else. Formal hierarchy exists for emergencies, but daily life runs on cooperation and informal negotiation. It works because the groups are small. Everyone is highly educated and selected for cooperation, and the shared understanding that conflict endangers everyone creates powerful incentives for compromise. Mars settlements will start similarly. Crews of a few dozen, everyone essential, everyone aware that survival requires cooperation. Decision-making will be partially formalized through mission protocols, but mostly practical and collective. The commander has authority over safety issues, but resource allocation, work schedules, and living arrangements get negotiated among residents. This isn't democracy in any formal sense, but it's not authoritarianism either. It's pragmatic collective survival. But what happens when the settlement reaches 200 people? 500? At some point, informal cooperation breaks down. You have too many people for everyone to know everyone else well. You have specialization, some people working in agriculture, others in manufacturing, others in administration. You have competing interests, groups that want resources allocated differently. You need formal mechanisms for making collective decisions and resolving disputes. You need government. The communication delay means this government must be genuinely autonomous. It cannot be a branch office of Earth institutions. It must have full legislative, executive, and judicial authority, because waiting hours for Earth's input isn't viable. This is where things get legally fascinating and politically dangerous. A truly autonomous Mars government, even a small one, represents something unprecedented. A human polity completely outside Earth's traditional jurisdictional frameworks. Not a ship at sea, which remains under maritime law. Not an Antarctic station, which operates under its national authority, but an actual independent political entity, even if small, existing beyond any Earth nation's practical control. Some nations will find this unacceptable. If a SpaceX-built settlement on Mars declares itself self-governing, is that legal under the Outer Space Treaty? The treaty says space activities remain under the jurisdiction of the launching state. But at what point does a permanent settlement with its own government stop being an activity and start being a political fact that treaties can't contain? When a child born on Mars, who has never been to Earth, turns 18, do they owe allegiance to their parents' nationality, to the company that employed their parents, or to Mars itself? These aren't just legal puzzles. They're questions about identity and belonging. As Mars develops its own governance, it will develop its own political culture, shaped by its unique circumstances. Direct democracy might be practical, with a few thousand residents connected by networks. Environmental constraints might make personal freedoms we take for granted on Earth. Water use, energy consumption, living space, matters of collective regulation. The experience of living in an artificial environment where every system must be maintained or everyone dies might create a very different political psychology than Earth's, more focused on collective responsibility, less tolerant of individual choices that endanger the group. Or maybe the opposite happens. Maybe Martians, precisely because they're so dependent on technology and collective infrastructure, develop fierce protections for individual autonomy in the spaces where it doesn't threaten survival. Maybe freedom of thought, expression, and personal belief become especially sacred because physical freedom is so constrained. The first generation of Martians might be conformist by necessity, but the second generation, born there, might rebel against that conformity and create something unexpected. Communication delay also affects how Mars relates to Earth politically. Imagine Mars has a formal representative in some future Earth-based space governance body. How does that representative actually represent Martian interests? They cannot consult on issues quickly. If a vote comes up that requires immediate decision, the representative must act on their own judgment or pre-established instructions, not real-time constituent input. This makes the representative far more powerful and far less accountable than Earth-based representatives who can check public opinion continuously. Alternatively, Maybe future Mars governance relies heavily on artificial intelligence to bridge the delay. AI systems could represent Martian interests in Earth-based forums, programmed to act according to principles established by Martian residents, but able to respond immediately without waiting for human input. This sounds like science fiction, but it's a serious proposal from some space governance theorists. If the speed of light prevents humans from governing across interplanetary distances, effectively, perhaps AI can serve as instantaneous proxies. Of course, this creates its own problems. Who programs the AI? What happens when its decisions conflict with what Martians would have chosen? Can you meaningfully consent to be governed by an algorithm? The deeper truth is that communication delay doesn't just complicate governance. It enables and perhaps necessitates independence. Once a Mars settlement can survive without constant Earth support, the fact that Earth cannot practically govern it day to day means Earth's authority becomes largely theoretical. Earth can still control some things: access to resources from Earth, recognition of Martian legal documents on Earth, perhaps future trade relationships. But internal Martian governance will be Martian, simply because there's no practical alternative. This will feel threatening to nations and institutions that established the settlements. They invested billions, took enormous risks, and now the settlements are becoming autonomous. From the settlers' perspective, it looks like natural development. From Earth's perspective, it might look like theft. And that tension could become conflict if not handled carefully. History offers both warning and hope. The American Revolution emerged partly from exactly this dynamic. Britain invested heavily in colonies. Then those colonies developed their own institutions and interests. Then conflict arose over who had authority. But other examples show peaceful transitions. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand moved from colonial status to independence gradually, through negotiated transfers of authority. The difference was whether the parent country could accept the colony's growing autonomy or insisted on maintaining control. For Mars, the question is whether Earth-based nations and corporations can accept the inevitability of Martian autonomy and plan for it, or whether they'll resist until resistance becomes conflict. The communication delay makes this more urgent than historical colonial situations. Martian autonomy isn't just politically desirable, it's physically necessary. You cannot govern from Earth when governing requires immediate decisions and Earth is 40 minutes away. So, democratic governance on Mars, or whatever form governance takes, will necessarily be local, autonomous, and adapted to circumstances Earth has never faced. The delay isn't just a technical challenge. It's a fundamental force pushing toward political independence. And within perhaps 50 years of permanent settlement, Mars will be self-governing in practice, whether or not Earth-based institutions formally recognize it. The only question is whether that transition happens through planning and agreement or through crisis and confrontation. The physics have already decided that Mars will govern itself. Only politics will determine whether that happens peacefully. Ethics always gets complicated when circumstances change dramatically, and nothing changes circumstances like living on a different planet. The moral frameworks we've developed over thousands of years on Earth emerge from Earth's conditions: breathable air, liquid water, ecosystems that sustained us long before we understood them. Mars has none of this. Every breath requires technology. Every drop of water must be extracted, recycled, guarded. And this changes not just how we live, but what we owe to each other, to future generations, and to the worlds themselves. Start with the most immediate question: planetary protection. Right now, Mars is a sterile world as far as we know. Cold, dry, bathed in radiation. It might harbor microbial life deep underground, where liquid water could exist, but we haven't found it yet. If Martian life exists, even as simple microbes, it would be the most significant biological discovery in human history. It would tell us life emerges not just once, but potentially wherever conditions allow. It would transform our understanding of biology, evolution, and our place in the universe. So should we protect Mars from contamination by Earth life? Current planetary protection protocols say yes, absolutely. Spacecraft sent to Mars are carefully sterilized. Landing sites are chosen partly to avoid areas where Martian life is most likely. The goal is to preserve Mars in its current state long enough to study it properly, to answer the question of whether life exists there before we accidentally destroy the evidence or the life itself. But permanent human settlement makes this protection impossible. Humans are walking ecosystems, carrying trillions of microorganisms. We shed bacteria constantly. Our waste contains Earth microbes. Our agriculture requires Earth microbes in soil. A permanent Mars settlement will inevitably introduce Earth life to Mars, probably within the first year. Sterilization protocols that work for robotic missions cannot work for human ones. We cannot sterilize ourselves without dying. This creates a genuine ethical dilemma. On one side, the argument for preservation. Mars has been Mars for 4 billion years. We have no right to fundamentally alter it within a few decades of arriving. If Martian life exists, we could be committing extinction on a planetary scale. The scientific value alone justifies extreme caution. And there's a deeper principle. Some argue Mars has intrinsic value, independent of human purposes, that preserving worlds in their natural state is ethically important, regardless of immediate human benefit. On the other side, the argument for settlement. Humanity needs a backup location. Earth faces existential risks, asteroid impacts, supervolcano eruptions, climate catastrophe, nuclear war. Having humans on multiple worlds dramatically improves our species' long-term survival odds. Moreover, the resources and knowledge gained from Mars settlement could help us solve problems on Earth. And philosophically, spreading life and consciousness to sterile worlds could be seen as increasing the universe's value, not diminishing it. Neither position is obviously wrong. Both rest on genuine values, and space ethics will have to navigate this tension, probably through compromise that satisfies no one completely. Maybe we designate large portions of Mars as protected wilderness, off limits to settlement permanently, preserving them for study and intrinsic value. Maybe we focus settlement on areas already confirmed lifeless while protecting regions where life might exist. Maybe we accept that we're changing Mars fundamentally, but try to document and study it thoroughly before and during the transformation. Then there's terraforming, the long-term project of making Mars Earth-like. This would take centuries and require deliberately altering the planet's atmosphere, temperature, and potentially magnetic field. The goal would be a Mars where humans can walk outside without spacesuits, where liquid water flows on the surface, where Earth plants grow in the soil. It's technically possible, though enormously difficult and expensive. But should we do it? If you view Mars as a resource, a place with no intrinsic value beyond human purposes, then terraforming is obviously desirable. It would make the planet far more habitable and valuable. If you view Mars as having intrinsic worth, as a unique planetary environment deserving preservation, then terraforming is vandalism on a planetary scale, the permanent destruction of a world. And if you believe Martian life might exist, even if we haven't found it yet, terraforming could be genocide. The debate isn't abstract. Serious proposals exist for beginning terraforming processes within this century, releasing greenhouse gases to warm the planet, crashing ice-rich comets into the surface to provide water and thicken the atmosphere. These projects could start before we've fully explored Mars, before we know with certainty whether life exists there. Once started, they'd be nearly impossible to reverse. We need ethical frameworks for decisions like this, and we need them soon. Another question: the rights and status of people born on Mars. A child born in a Martian habitat has never breathed Earth's air, never felt Earth's gravity, never walked under open sky. Their body develops in 0.38 Earth gravity. Their psychology forms in an enclosed artificial environment. They're human, but their experience of being human is fundamentally different from anyone born on Earth. Do we owe them? For one thing, we probably owe them the choice of whether to stay or return to Earth. But that choice might not be real. Growing up in low gravity affects bone density, muscle development, possibly cardiovascular systems. A child who spends their first 15 years on Mars might not be physically capable of adapting to Earth gravity. Their body might not handle it. They could be permanently Martian, unable to visit the world where their species evolved. Is it ethical to create people who are physically adapted to one world and incapable of living on another? Some argue it's no different from being born anywhere with unique conditions. Someone born at high altitude in the Himalayas develops different lung capacity than someone born at sea level. We don't consider that unethical. But the Himalayan resident can still visit sea level. The Martian might not be able to visit Earth at all. That's a different level of constraint. Then there's the question of consent. Adults choosing to go to Mars are making an informed decision about risks and constraints. Children born there made no such choice. They inherit whatever circumstances their parents created. If those circumstances include permanent physical limitation or life in an enclosed habitat where resources are strictly controlled and individual freedom is constrained, have we wronged them? Or is being born on Mars, with all its limitations, still better than not being born at all? Philosophy has struggled with these questions of consent and future generations for centuries. The specific Martian case makes them concrete. We're actively considering creating humans whose lives will be fundamentally shaped by our decisions, made before they exist, about settling a hostile world. Getting this wrong has real consequences for real people. There's also the question of genetic modification. Mars's radiation environment is harsh. Without Earth's thick atmosphere and magnetic field, cosmic rays and solar radiation hit the surface at levels that significantly increase cancer risk. Settlers can shield themselves partially through habitat design and protective clothing, but complete protection is probably impossible. So eventually, someone will propose genetically modifying humans for radiation resistance. The technology will likely exist within decades. We could give future Martians more efficient DNA repair mechanisms, enhanced cellular protection, maybe even radiation-resistant biochemistry borrowed from extremophile organisms on Earth. This would make Mars settlement safer and more practical. But it would also create a subspecies of humanity, genetically distinct, adapted to Mars, but potentially less adapted to Earth. We'd be engineering human evolution deliberately. The ethical questions are staggering. Some see this as playing God, crossing lines we shouldn't cross. Others see it as responsible adaptation, using our capabilities to protect our descendants. And others point out that if we don't modify humans for Mars, we're condemning Martians to higher cancer rates and shorter lives when we have the technology to prevent it. Is it more ethical to modify or to refrain from modifying when both choices affect people who don't exist yet and can't consent? Space ethics also forces us to think about justice and fairness in new contexts. The first Mars settlers will be carefully selected, highly educated, physically healthy, psychologically screened. They'll be privileged in the sense that they're chosen from billions, but they'll also be taking enormous risks, living in harsh conditions, probably working far harder than most people on Earth. Is this fair? Is it just that some people get the opportunity to pioneer Mars while others don't? And what about the wealth generated by space resources? If asteroid mining succeeds, it could create trillions in value. Who should benefit? The companies and individuals who took the risk and did the work? The nations that provided initial funding and legal frameworks? All of humanity, since space is declared the common heritage of mankind. There's no consensus, and the disagreement could shape space development profoundly. The Antarctic Treaty model suggests one approach: international cooperation, shared access, benefits distributed broadly. But Antarctica never became economically valuable enough to test whether that model could survive serious money being at stake. Space will be different. When actual wealth is being generated, principles about common heritage face pressure from those doing the work and taking the risks. Perhaps the deepest ethical question is about purpose. Why are we going to space at all? Is it escape, abandoning Earth for new worlds when we've damaged this one? Is it expansion, the natural continuation of human exploration and growth? Is it survival, backing up humanity against existential catastrophe? Is it transformation, becoming something more than a single planet species? The answer matters because it shapes what we prioritize. If space is escape, we might settle hastily, accepting damage to Mars and injustice in how we organize settlements because we're desperate. If it's expansion, we might be more careful, trying to learn from Earth's mistakes. If it's survival, we prioritize redundancy and resilience over everything else. If it's transformation, we might experiment radically with new ways of living and organizing ourselves. Probably, it's all of these, different things to different people and groups. But the lack of shared purpose could create conflict. Earth-based institutions seeing space as a resource to be managed carefully versus settlers seeing it as a new start beyond Earth's rules. Scientists wanting to preserve and study versus engineers wanting to build and transform. Each perspective has validity, but they point toward very different futures. Space ethics won't be resolved through abstract philosophy. It will emerge from practical decisions made under pressure by people dealing with real situations. But thinking through these questions now, while we still have time to shape frameworks and establish norms, is crucial. Because once we've contaminated Mars, we can't uncontaminate it. Once we've created genetically modified humans adapted to other worlds, we can't unmake them. Once we've established patterns of governance and resource control, changing them becomes exponentially harder. We have a brief window where space ethics is still mostly theoretical, where we can think carefully about what we want to preserve and what we're willing to change. That window is closing. Within a decade, we'll be making irreversible decisions about Mars and beyond. The question is whether we'll make those decisions thoughtfully, with genuine consideration of competing values and long-term consequences, or whether we'll simply rush ahead and deal with the ethical aftermath later. History suggests we'll do some of both. But the more thought we put in now, the better our chances of creating an interplanetary civilization we can be proud of. Money changes everything, and space will generate money on scales difficult to imagine. A single metallic asteroid, just 1 kilometer across, could contain more platinum group metals than have been mined in all of human history. The total value of resources in the asteroid belt probably exceeds Earth's entire GDP by orders of magnitude. When wealth like that becomes accessible, it doesn't just create opportunities. It creates power dynamics, inequalities, and political pressures that will shape interplanetary society as much as any constitution or treaty. The economic relationship between Earth and space settlements will start simple and become complicated quickly. Initially, space settlements are purely dependent. Every gram of equipment, every spare part, every supply shipment comes from Earth at enormous cost. A Mars settlement in the 2030s might cost $10,000 per kilogram just for transportation, never mind the actual goods. The settlement produces nothing Earth needs because bringing anything back costs the same $10,000 per kilogram. It's pure investment with no immediate return, funded by governments or wealthy investors betting on eventual payoff. But this dependence is temporary. Space settlements will work frantically to become self-sufficient because every item they can produce locally saves that $10,000 transportation cost. Water extraction and recycling, food production through agriculture, manufacturing spare parts and building materials, energy generation through solar panels. Within a decade or two, a Mars settlement might produce 90% of what it needs locally. It will still depend on Earth for complex electronics, specialized equipment, and some raw materials, but the dependence decreases steadily. This is when economics gets interesting. A partially self-sufficient Mars settlement can start producing things Earth wants. The most obvious is scientific data. Mars is an enormous laboratory for geology, astrobiology, and climate science. But data has limited economic value. More valuable would be resources scarce on Earth, but abundant in space. Helium-3, potentially useful for future fusion reactors, is rare on Earth, but present on the Moon. Rare Earth elements, crucial for electronics and concentrated in certain asteroids. Even water, if extracted from asteroids and used to supply orbital industries, avoiding the cost of lifting it from Earth's gravity well. But here's the challenge. Bringing physical resources back to Earth costs almost as much as sending them from Earth. The economics only work for extremely valuable, low-mass materials. Platinum worth $50,000 per kilogram justifies $10,000 shipping costs. Iron worth pennies per kilogram does not. So the first space economy won't be about exporting bulk resources to Earth. It will be about using space resources to build infrastructure in space, which then provides services Earth wants. Imagine orbital manufacturing facilities built from asteroid materials, operating in zero gravity and unlimited solar energy. They could produce pharmaceuticals, crystal growing for semiconductors, exotic materials that require microgravity. The products are small and high value enough to justify Earth delivery costs. The facilities themselves never come to Earth, just their products. This creates an economic ecosystem where space pays for itself, not by mining resources for Earth, but by doing things Earth can't do efficiently. Or consider space-based solar power. Satellites in geosynchronous orbit collecting solar energy 24 hours a day, beaming it to Earth as microwaves, converted back to electricity on the ground. The energy is clean, constant, and abundant. The economics are marginal with current technology, but if you're building satellites from asteroid materials instead of launching everything from Earth, they become viable. Now, space infrastructure provides something Earth desperately needs: unlimited clean energy. These economic models change the power relationship. An Earth completely dependent on space-based solar power for half its energy needs cannot simply dictate terms to space settlements. Economic interdependence creates political leverage. Mars might not be able to survive without Earth's complex manufactured goods, but if Earth depends on Mars for something critical, perhaps pharmaceutical production, or rare isotopes, or scientific knowledge, then the relationship is negotiation between partners, not control by a parent over a dependent colony. This is how colonies historically became independent. They started dependent on the mother country for everything. Gradually, they developed local production, local trade, local economic interests, distinct from the mother country. Eventually, their economies were large enough and diverse enough that they could contemplate independence. Economic self-sufficiency preceded and enabled political independence. Space settlements will follow similar patterns, but faster. The timeline from complete dependence to partial self-sufficiency might be just 20 years, compared to centuries for Earth's historical colonies. This is because space settlements must pursue self-sufficiency or die. An Earth colony that depended on supply ships from Europe faced hardship if those ships stopped coming, but the colonists could still hunt, farm, and survive. A Mars settlement that loses Earth supplies dies in months when life support systems fail and cannot be repaired. This desperation accelerates technological development and local production. Money and trade also create questions about currency and exchange. Will Mars settlements use Earth currencies, dollars, or euros, or yuan? Initially, yes, because they're trading primarily with Earth. But as Mars-to-Mars trade develops, local currencies might emerge. A Mars settlement might issue its own currency, backed by local resources or productive capacity, used for internal transactions. This could be purely practical, reducing transaction costs and accounting for local economic conditions. Or it could be political, an assertion of economic autonomy and a step toward full independence. Cryptocurrencies or digital currencies might be especially attractive for interplanetary trade. They're not tied to any Earth nation. They can be transferred across space via radio signals, and they're programmable, allowing complex smart contracts that automatically execute when conditions are met. A mining company on an asteroid and a manufacturer on Mars could use a smart contract. Upon delivery of X tons of metal, Y amount of cryptocurrency transfers automatically, verified by neutral observers. No banks needed. No waiting for transactions to clear across light-speed delays. Just automatic execution of agreed terms. But economics also creates dangers. The pattern of colonial exploitation on Earth is too familiar to ignore. Powerful entities extracting value from less powerful ones, maintaining dependency through control of trade and resources, enriching themselves while the local population sees little benefit. This could easily happen in space. A corporation that establishes a settlement, controls transportation, owns the infrastructure, and has monopoly power over trade could extract enormous wealth while paying workers just enough to keep them alive and working. The company-town problem we discussed earlier is fundamentally economic. Workers paid in company scrip, shopping at company stores with inflated prices, perpetually in debt and unable to leave. In space, this could be worse because leaving isn't just difficult, it's impossible without the company's transportation. Economic control becomes absolute control. Preventing this requires deliberate policy choices. Labor protections ensuring workers have genuine rights even when economically dependent. Regulations limiting company power over essential services. Perhaps requiring that settlements above a certain size have independent governance separate from the economic entity that established them. Or requiring profit sharing, so residents of a settlement benefit directly from the wealth it generates, rather than seeing it all flow to Earth-based shareholders. Some argue market competition will prevent exploitation. If one company treats its workers badly, other companies will offer better terms to attract talent. But competition only works when workers have genuine alternatives. In the early decades of space settlement, when there are only a few settlements and transportation is expensive and limited, workers might have no real alternatives. You take the terms offered, or you don't go to space at all. Another economic challenge is ensuring benefits from space development reach beyond the wealthy. If space resources generate trillions in wealth, but it all goes to billionaire investors and the corporations they own, we've just exported Earth's inequality to space and probably made it worse. Some propose that space resources, as the common heritage of mankind, should generate revenue for global benefit, perhaps through licensing fees paid to an international body, distributed to all nations based on need or population. This sounds idealistic, and it probably is, but the principle matters. If space development only benefits those already wealthy enough to participate, it becomes another mechanism for concentrating wealth and power. If it somehow benefits humanity broadly, it could help solve problems on Earth, funding development, research, or addressing climate change. The Outer Space Treaty language about space being the province of all mankind implies this broader benefit, but the treaty has no enforcement mechanism and no clear framework for making it real. Asteroid mining makes these questions urgent and concrete. When a company starts extracting platinum from an asteroid, where does the money go? To the company's shareholders, obviously. They took the risk and did the work. But should some percentage go to an international fund? Should the company pay for the right to mine, like mining licenses on Earth? And who collects these payments and decides how to spend them? Nobody has good answers yet. The nations passing space mining laws, the United States, Luxembourg, UAE, all allow companies to keep what they mine with minimal international revenue sharing. This works for now because space mining hasn't happened yet and generates no revenue. But when it does, nations left out of the profits will object. They'll argue space resources should benefit everyone, not just countries wealthy enough to fund space programs. the tension could become serious. There's also the question of economic independence timelines. When can a Mars settlement survive economically without Earth? This depends on technological progress and settlement size. A settlement of a few hundred people, even if producing most of their own food and energy, still needs complex equipment from Earth. They cannot manufacture computer chips or advanced medical equipment or the thousands of specialized components modern technology requires. They're decades away from that level of industrial sophistication. But a settlement of 10,000 with diverse industries and significant manufacturing capacity might reach a tipping point. They might be able to produce everything essential locally, even if Earth goods remain desirable luxuries. At that point, Mars could choose economic independence. Stop trading with Earth. Stop accepting Earth currency. Manage its own economy entirely. This would be economically costly. They'd lose access to Earth's vast production capacity, but it would be survivable. This is when economics and politics merge completely. Economic independence makes political independence possible. A Mars settlement that genuinely doesn't need Earth cannot be controlled by Earth except through military force, which is impractical across interplanetary distances. So the timeline to economic self-sufficiency is also the timeline to potential political independence. Probably 50 to 70 years after initial settlement, maybe sooner, if technology advances rapidly. The crucial question is whether Earth-based powers can accept this trajectory, can plan for it, can create frameworks that allow smooth transition from dependence to independence, or whether they'll try to maintain control through economic mechanisms, ownership of critical infrastructure, control of transportation, monopoly on advanced technology. That strategy might work for a time, but it creates resentment and eventual conflict. History shows that trying to maintain colonial economic control after colonies have outgrown dependence usually ends badly. The economics of interplanetary society will shape everything else: governance, culture, independence movements, conflicts, or cooperation. Money isn't everything, but in space, as on Earth, it's the foundation that determines what's possible and who has power. Getting the economics right, or at least less wrong than historical precedents, might be the most important factor in whether humanity's expansion into space creates flourishing societies or replicates and amplifies our worst patterns of exploitation and inequality. We've walked through the landscape of interplanetary governance, law, and ethics, examining questions that don't yet have answers. Now it's time to step back and see the larger patterns, because humanity has been here before, not in space, but in the fundamental situation of expanding into new territories and figuring out how to organize ourselves there. History doesn't repeat, but it echoes. And those echoes tell us something about what's coming. The first pattern is this: governance always lags behind expansion. People move into new territories before anyone has figured out the rules. They make it up as they go, creating informal systems that eventually formalize into laws and institutions. This happened with Phoenician traders in the Mediterranean, with Vikings settling Iceland, with American pioneers moving west faster than government could follow, with internet communities developing their own norms before any legal framework existed. It will happen in space. We won't solve space governance through careful planning and international conferences, though those help. We'll solve it through people living in space, encountering problems, finding solutions, and gradually building those solutions into formal systems. The Outer Space Treaty and Artemis Accords create frameworks, but the real governance will emerge on the ground, or rather, on Mars and in orbital habitats, developed by people dealing with actual situations. This means we should expect messiness. Early space settlements will have unclear authority, disputed jurisdictions, improvised justice, and probably some injustices we'll regret. That's not failure. That's how human systems develop. The goal isn't perfection from the start. It's creating conditions where learning and adaptation can happen, where mistakes can be corrected, where better systems can emerge from experience. The second pattern: new frontiers attract idealists and opportunists in roughly equal measure. People go to challenging places for many reasons. Some seek freedom from existing systems, wanting to build something new. Some seek wealth, seeing opportunity in resources and markets. Some seek adventure, glory, or simply escape. This mix creates both dynamism and conflict. The idealists push for just systems and noble purposes. The opportunists push for practical results and personal benefit. The tension between them shapes how societies develop. Space will attract both types intensely. Idealists will see Mars as a chance to create better governance than Earth, to avoid our mistakes, to build societies around different values. Opportunists will see asteroid mining and orbital manufacturing as paths to enormous wealth. Both are needed. Idealists without practical resources achieve nothing. Opportunists without ethical frameworks create exploitation. The question is whether they can work together, each tempering the other's excesses, or whether they'll fragment into competing visions that cannot coexist. The third pattern: communication technology shapes governance profoundly. When governance required physical travel to deliver messages and commands, local authority was necessary by default. As communication improved, centralization became possible. Telegraph, telephone, radio, and internet each enabled more centralized coordination and control. But interplanetary distances break this pattern. Even with light-speed communication, the delays are too long for real-time coordination. We're going backwards in a sense, returning to a world where local authority is necessary because the center is too far away to govern effectively. This isn't bad. It creates opportunities for diverse governance experiments. Multiple settlements can try different approaches, learning from each other's successes and failures. What works for a Mars settlement might not work for an orbital habitat or an asteroid mining operation. The environments are different. The populations will be different. The challenges are different. Diversity in governance allows adaptation to local conditions, but it also creates coordination challenges. How do multiple settlements with different governance systems interact? How do they resolve disputes? How do they cooperate on projects that benefit everyone, like space traffic control or emergency rescue capabilities? These questions will require meta-governance, frameworks for how different systems relate to each other. Something like federalism, where local autonomy exists within a larger structure that handles coordination. Or something like the European Union, independent entities agreeing to cooperate on specific issues while maintaining sovereignty otherwise. The fourth pattern: economic structures determine political possibilities more than ideals do. Every society's governance reflects its economic base. Feudalism emerged from agricultural economies where land was the primary wealth source. Democracy strengthened in commercial societies where wealth was more distributed. Authoritarian systems often emerge where resources are concentrated and easily controlled. Space economies will shape space governance similarly. If space settlements remain economically dependent on a few large corporations or powerful nations, governance will reflect that concentration of power. If economic activity diversifies, with many independent operators and distributed wealth, governance will likely be more democratic and pluralistic. If asteroid mining generates enormous concentrated wealth, that wealth will translate into political influence. We cannot design space governance independent of economic realities. We have to design economic structures that enable the governance we want. The fifth pattern, generational change drives transformation. The first generation in any new place remains psychologically connected to where they came from. They're immigrants, not natives. But the second generation, born in the new place, belongs there in ways their parents never will. They take local conditions as normal, resent being governed by places they've never seen, and eventually demand autonomy or independence. This happened with every colonial relationship in history. It will happen in space. Children born on Mars will be Martian in a way their Earth-born parents cannot be. They'll grow up in low gravity, in enclosed habitats, with Mars as their reference point for normal. Earth will be a foreign place they see on screens. Gravity so strong it would crush them. Atmosphere so thick and wet and uncontrolled it seems chaotic. They'll study Earth history and governance, but they won't feel bound by it. And when they reach adulthood, they'll want to govern themselves according to Martian needs and values, not Earth's. This generational transition will take 30 to 50 years after initial settlement. It's predictable and probably inevitable. The question is whether Earth-based institutions can accept it gracefully or will resist it, turning natural evolution into conflict. So what futures are possible? We can sketch several scenarios, not predictions, but possibilities, each reflecting different choices and different patterns from history. The Federation scenario. Multiple space settlements develop autonomously, but remain connected to Earth through a federal structure. Think of the European Union, or a very loose version of the United States. Each settlement governs itself internally, but they coordinate on shared issues through a space federation that handles interplanetary law, trade frameworks, and conflict resolution. Earth is a member, but not dominant. This requires Earth accepting space settlements as partners rather than possessions. Difficult, but not impossible. The independence scenario. Space settlements break away from Earth governance completely within 50 to 70 years. Mars becomes independent, perhaps as multiple city-states. Orbital habitats form their own confederation. Asteroid mining operations operate as corporate states. They trade with Earth, but don't accept Earth's authority. This is probably inevitable eventually, but whether it happens through peaceful separation or conflict depends on how Earth responds. Historical precedent is mixed. Some colonial separations were peaceful, others weren't. The fragmentation scenario. No unified space governance emerges. Instead, settlements develop wildly different systems, some democratic, some corporate, some experimental, some authoritarian. They compete, sometimes cooperate, sometimes conflict. It's messy and inefficient, but also innovative. Multiple models coexist, and people can choose which system they want to join, creating evolution through competition. This might be the most likely scenario in the medium term. before any unified frameworks can develop. The corporate scenario. Large corporations establish and maintain control over space settlements through economic power. Settlements remain company towns, governed by employment contracts rather than democratic systems. This would be economically efficient but ethically troubling, replicating the worst patterns of Earth's industrial history. It's possible, especially in early decades, but probably unstable long-term as populations grow and demand real political rights. The disaster scenario. Space governance fails completely. Settlements conflict over resources. Unsafe practices cause catastrophic accidents. Exploitation creates resentment that erupts into violence. Without functional governance frameworks, space development becomes chaotic and dangerous, possibly setting back human expansion by decades. This is avoidable, but not impossible, especially if we don't think seriously about governance before problems emerge. None of these will happen purely. Reality will be some mix. Different settlements following different paths, frameworks evolving over time, elements of success and failure coexisting. But thinking about scenarios helps us understand what choices matter and what consequences they might have. The deepest lesson from history is about adaptability. Humans have lived in deserts and Arctic regions, on islands and mountains, in cities and wilderness. We've organized ourselves as tribes and empires, democracies and monarchies, federations and city-states. We've adapted to every environment Earth offers and created governance systems appropriate to each. Space is more challenging, but it's not fundamentally different. We'll figure it out because we have to, because we're good at adapting, because the alternative is failure. But history also teaches that we can do this better or worse. We can learn from past mistakes or repeat them. We can think ahead about what kind of interplanetary civilization we want to create, or we can stumble into whatever emerges from immediate pressures and power dynamics. We can try to establish principles of justice, equality, and sustainability, or we can let exploitation and inequality extend into space. The window for thoughtful choice is narrow. Within a decade, permanent space settlements begin. Within 2 decades, they'll have populations large enough to need real governance. Within 3 decades, children will be born there who are genuinely Martian. Within 5 decades, economic and political independence becomes realistic. These timelines aren't speculative. They're based on current technology trajectories and announced plans. So the question facing us now, here on Earth in the 2020s, is whether we'll use this time wisely. Whether we'll have serious conversations about space governance, ethics, and economics. Whether we'll create frameworks flexible enough to adapt, but strong enough to prevent the worst abuses. Whether we'll think about justice and sustainability alongside profit and expansion. We won't get everything right. History guarantees that. But we can get enough right to create space societies that are more just, more sustainable, and more humane than much of Earth's history. We have the advantage of hindsight, thousands of years of human political experience to learn from. The question is whether we'll use it. Interplanetary society isn't some distant future anymore. It's beginning now, in the decisions we make about space law, in the designs for Mars habitats, in the economic structures we allow or prevent, in the ethical frameworks we develop or neglect. Every choice echoes forward, shaping what comes next. And perhaps that's the most important thing history teaches us. The future isn't predetermined It's created through choices, some grand and some small, by people trying to navigate circumstances they don't fully understand, building systems that outlast them. We're those people now, standing at the beginning of humanity's expansion into space. The societies that emerge among the stars will reflect the thought and care we put into foundational questions now. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but enough. If we're thoughtful enough, humble enough, and wise enough to learn from the long story of human governance on Earth, we can create an interplanetary civilization worth being part of. Not utopia, but something functional, something just, something that makes the enormous effort of leaving Earth worthwhile. That's the challenge. That's the opportunity. And that's what the next century of human history will be about, figuring out how to be human when humanity is no longer confined to one world. We don't have all the answers, but we're learning to ask the right questions. And sometimes, that's where every important journey begins.